I mean, something that's disappointing about American movies is just how few depict working class life. So overwhelmingly, the focus is on the experiences and the strivings of the middle class and the affluent. And there are even fewer movies that depict union organizing at all, let alone in a realistic and compelling way. So that's why I wanted to take the opportunity today to highlight the movie The Killing Floor, which was directed by Bill Duke in 1984. It's kind of a made-for-TV movie. It's pretty rare to find. But the movie deals with the attempts to organize workers in meatpacking plants of the Chicago stockyards during World War I. And the central focus of the movie is the immense challenging of uniting a diverse workforce that was usually divided among racial and ethnic lines. So let's first take a look at the trailer.
Why don't we say it like this? The Lord has seen fit to reward me with a position at the Chicago stockyards.
Yes, ma'am.
It's straight and simple, boys. We want everybody to join the union.
Mister, I come up here to make a living. I ain't getting in no white man's fight, no, sir.
Now get back to work, all of you.
You do whatever the boss says, don't you, boy?
Yeah, you ain't seen me in a whole year. You didn't bring me no flowers or nothing. But I guess that's what Chicago do to folks.
A lot of Irish gangs all looking through here. So you gotta be careful how you step.
See, there are all kinds of butchers. The stickers do like this.
The days of peasants and serfs and slaves must be behind us. Now we're Americans now. Polish, Irish, colored, whatever you are. Let us be 100% union.
It's just like one of them cows, eh? Going to the slaughter if the white man leads him to it.
How y'all colored folk doing?
How you doing, white boy?
They're gonna keep pushing us until we start killing each other.
Coloreds will be brought in by the militia.
You gonna herd the coloreds into the yards like a bunch of cattle? We was making progress over here. Now there's nothing but fire and smoke. I didn't ride that box all the way up here to be the same as I left. I was nothing when I come up here. And I ain't gonna stay nothing.
Tomorrow, where you gonna be?
Me and the union gonna be outside the damn slaughterhouse trying to keep those people from coming in to kill the coloreds.
I love this movie because it stays true to the historical record and is painfully realistic about the challenges organizers in the labor movement face. Yes, there are parts of the movie that are inspiring and uplifting, but it doesn't try to paint labor organizing as a heroic struggle that is bound to succeed. As the story unfolds, it's clear that even with the best intentions and willpower, defeat is still possible. Frank Custer is the main character, and his life follows that of so many other African Americans in the early 20th century. As scores of white working class men went to fight in World War I, it created a huge labor shortage and a demand in the North for Black workers. This spurred a massive migration of Black people to northern cities, such as Chicago, where the film is set. This migration caused something of a sociological revolution in many cities. Southern Blacks had to quickly learn to navigate a foreign urban landscape. While they were now free of the most blatant assaults of Jim Crow, racial discrimination, of course, still permeated their daily lives. The film depicts how various Black institutions related to the packing house companies. For example, Frank Custer gets a job in meatpacking by going to the local YMCA in a Black community, which gives him a letter of recommendation for a job. This might seem like a mundane thing, but it highlights the strength packing house companies held over their workforce. Before the Great Depression, meatpacking companies were looked upon as benevolent institutions in the Black community. This would complicate the attempts of unions to win over Black workers. I wrote about how this played out in Chicago in a recent Jacobin article where I said, the paternalistic rule of the meatpacking companies won the allegiance of many workers. Top companies like Swift and Armour financed the activities of many important Black institutions like the Urban League and the Wabash Avenue YMCA. And discrimination by labor unions in previous years allowed the companies to cynically use Black workers as strikebreakers. As a Chicago packing house company president described in the late 1920s, we took the Negroes on as strikebreakers in 1921 and have kept them ever since in order to be prepared for any kind of outbreak. One of the things that struck me about this movie after watching it again is just how much of the action takes place in the workplace at the site of production. Just think about it. When is the last time you saw a movie where most of the activity is on the shop floor? By doing this, the film demonstrates how central work and production was and still is to society and workers' lives. In these scenes, we see the division of labor in meatpacking and how it was often racialized. Frank is chosen to work on the killing floor, which is where black workers were overwhelmingly concentrated. The killing floor was the dirtiest and hardest work, where the animals were slaughtered and prepared to be processed. But it was also the most strategic location, because after all, no meat could be processed if the animals were not slaughtered first. This dynamic made black workers very important to the success of unionization. We also see the diversity of the workforce. Frank is bewildered to see workers speaking Polish and all kinds of languages he's never heard of. At one point, he says, "How are you supposed to work with folks when you couldn't even understand them?" On the first day, Frank's friend Thomas gets in a fight with white workers. He decides to quit and join the army. And early on, we see that the pace of production is a central issue the workers face. With the war at its peak, demand for meat to feed all the soldiers was high. The managers were constantly speeding up production to dangerous levels for the workers. We see scenes of shop floor actions where workers refuse to work until the manager agrees to slow down the pace. Again, this is something rarely shown in a film. Frank finds himself caught in between a racial division about the union. The plant has a union presence, but a majority of the workers aren't yet convinced to join. Older union activists recognize that Frank isn't afraid to stand up to people, so they try to recruit him. But at first, Frank sees the union as a white person thing. There was only one older black worker involved in the union. He tells one union activist that he just came up here to make a living, not to get involved in the white man's fight. Other black coworkers ridicule the one black union activist, calling him an Uncle Tom. Some of these workers talk about their bad experiences with unions in the past that discriminated against them. One character, Heavy Williams, is the main leader among anti-union black workers. He says that it's good when unions and management fight it out. Under those conditions, black workers can take advantage. While pro-union people would, of course, disagree with this statement, it highlights the material roots of black workers' skepticism of unions at the time. Until the 1930s, black workers were often not allowed into unions, and usually the only way to get work was as strikebreakers. So under those conditions, it makes sense why many black workers saw unions as something alien to them. But eventually, Frank is persuaded to attend the union meeting, and he likes what he sees. He sees workers of different backgrounds uniting together, using translators to overcome language barriers. The main demands articulated were a wage increase, an 8-hour workday, and overtime pay. Back in the workplace, Frank participated in a shop floor action against speed up. Afterwards, white workers, even some who he had conflicts with earlier, come up to him and shake his hand. And that scene might seem a little corny, but again, it gets at a very real dynamic in union organizing. Packing house workers, just like many other kinds of workers, started to overcome racial divisions through concrete actions of solidarity related to the workplace. They did not and could not do it through anti-racist trainings or white fragility sessions. It could only come about by proving solidarity through action. And that solidarity was built around shared mutual interests. You can see this outlook in the words of the packing house workers themselves. So, for example, Charles Fisher, who was a packing house worker in Kansas City that was instrumental in building the union in the 1930s, said this: "There was, of course, the religious difference and that racial difference, which were obstacles at first, but which were all overcome. All of them, simply by showing the people that we all had a common goal to make a decent living, to have a decent standard of living, and this is the way to go, and the only way to go, because without a union, we're all lost." And it's so. It's just that simple. There's nothing complicated about it at all. In the movie, Frank becomes imbued with the spirit of racial unity. We see the role unions played in providing a site for social integration. In one scene, we see Frank dancing with a white Polish woman at a union-sponsored party. And this is not made up. These things were happening in unions at the time. And you'd have to look very hard to find another institution in the early 1900s where integrated gatherings like that were taking place, or where a black man could dance with a white woman without it ending in violence. Despite this progress, the film does a great job of showing the precariousness of working class life and how much the union's progress is still dependent on outside structural factors. During the war, the labor market was tight and the workers had leverage. When World War I ends, all of a sudden, the companies are back in control. They fire all the union activists and disrupt the union's progress. Racial conflict rises again as black workers are bitter about their jobs being taken by whites again. Packing house companies cynically played on racial division. They argued to black workers that the union was a force that disrupted their ability to secure stable employment. They plant false flyers saying the union wants to be all white. And we see a constant battle between individual and collective resistance. So Frank's friend Thomas returns from World War I, and like so many other black veterans, is bitter about how he's treated despite risking his life for the country. In one scene, Frank says to him that their only protection is the union. Thomas responds by pulling out a gun and saying, "This is the only protection I need." And that moment encapsulates so much of the struggle over what black resistance would look like. After World War I, this is the age of the so-called New Negro, of black people that weren't willing to take the same shit that they did before, of black people that were more willing to be militant. But what form would that take? Would it be black individuals arming themselves against whites? Or would it be collective struggles to form unions and other organizations? And throughout the 1920s, a more individual form of resistance had won out as the trade union movement floundered. These tensions came to a boiling point with the Chicago race riot of 1919. It started when a young black boy was stoned to death by whites while swimming. The city exploded with rage as white gangs terrorized black communities, and blacks were not afraid to fight back. At least 40 people died in these riots. And again, what the film gives us is a picture of how these riots affected the workplace. People were not able to get to work, but the company provides charity donations of food to their workers at the YMCA. Black workers again get the impression that the company is there for them, but the union is not. In a nihilistic scene, the anti-union stalwart, Heavy Williams, forces Frank to beg for a handout from the company and then lectures him about why the company is better than the union. It's a depressing scene of a worker carrying out the will of the company. Then, all the black workers hand Frank back their union buttons. At the next union meeting, white workers won't let Frank speak because of a rumor that black workers burned down a Polish neighborhood. Racial division has won out, but there are still small signs that certain lessons have been learned. As black workers return to work, the union organizes to make sure they aren't attacked by other white workers. And the most important part of the movie is the final scene, and this is where the spoiler might come. In the locker room, Frank tries to give one more rousing speech to black workers about why the union is important. He tells them that they're trying to fight for a better life. That is why they came to the North, not just to take what the company gives them. The workers listen to him, but ultimately they are not convinced and walk away to start their workday. Then one young black worker comes back to Frank and shakes his hand. And for me, that scene says so much about the long game of organizing. How sometimes you need to plant seeds a long time before they can grow. The reality was the social and political barriers at that time were too much for the union to overcome. But the groundwork was laid for the next upsurge. If we fast forward 15 years to the mid-1930s, this time, meatpacking workers were able to unite across racial lines and build an incredibly strong union. Many people, like that worker who shook Frank's hand at the end, were involved. They had lived through a defeat but had learned lessons from it, and were able to use that knowledge to make the next attempt successful. Many white workers learned from that experience as well. In the 1930s, workers that had experienced early defeats, even those that had racist attitudes as individuals, understood that this time they had to include black workers or they were doomed to defeat. And the union that was eventually formed, the United Packing House Workers of America, was not just any union. They were arguably the most advanced union when it came to fighting for racial justice inside and outside the workplace. The former NAACP labor director Herbert Hill, who was often very critical of labor's track record on race, said this of the UPWA. The uniqueness of this union was that it perceived itself not merely as a collective bargaining agent that provided certain services to its members in return for dues, but rather as a labor organization involved in social change. So The Killing Floor is a gem for its sober but still inspirational portrayal of multiracial union organizing and should serve as a model for all political filmmakers. And Jen, since you just watched it last night, I'm curious about your reactions to the movie.
So I want to first say that I went in watching The Killing Floor with very little knowledge about the movie. I knew that it was about, interracial workers at a meatpacking plant in the early 20th century. I also knew that it was a movie that first aired on PBS. I don't know if you mentioned that, but it was a made-for-TV movie in the 1980s. So given all of that, to be quite honest, Paul, I did not have high hopes. I was like, I know Paul likes it, so obviously I'm going to watch it, but like, a PBS movie about interracial union organizing, like the potential for it to be like extremely bad and corny, like in my mind was like pretty high, right? And I want to say for the first half of the movie, like I liked it, but I was like, it's a little on the nose because of all of the like interracial solidarity. Like Frank, the main character that you were talking about, he was an impoverished sharecropper in the South. He comes to the North. He like lands in a Black neighborhood in Chicago, and he's like, this is really great. He starts making friends with the white workers at the meatpacking plant. Everything is on the up and up, but for everybody who hasn't yet seen The Killing Floor, definitely like it gets dark. It gets really devastating. And I actually think that what I liked most about the movie is that it really does kind of defy an easy narrative, right? So like after the first half of the movie, when you kind of think that things are going to be like rosy, you really get hit with the reality of what happened. And I think what is important about the kind of depiction of that failure, of that, union failure, is that that's not really didactic either. I think that all of the characters in the movie are extremely complex. The racist white workers are actually complex, but so is the anti-union Black worker who, ends up basically being a catalyst in the breaking of the union. I mean, he's not like none of these characters are purely evil or purely good. And I think that's really interesting. And, when we get Eileen on in a couple minutes, like I definitely, one of the things I want to ask her about is kind of this tendency for moralism in American movies. I think that's something that we see a lot. And I think that The Killing Floor really resists that.
Yeah. And what kind of impressed me so much, I mean, like you said, there's corny parts, there are parts that are on the nose. I'm not saying this is like the greatest film ever made, but
no, I thought it was good. I like those corny parts now, but anyway, sorry, go on.
But what really had interested me, because I've been obsessed with the packing house workers because of just what an incredible union they were. And I've done research and written a few articles, and like watching the movie, like how historically accurate it is in every sense. Like they really followed it closely and like get everything right and all these other dynamics, so it's almost like watching a documentary in a way, because of how accurate it is.
Yeah. I also want to add just to the end of the movie, which I agree with your reading of it, but I also want to point out that, even though there is kind of this moment of hope where, as you say, the two worker, Frank and, the young Black worker, they sort of shake hands, and it seems like the union, might have a second chance at some point in the future, which of course you point out it does. That scene only comes after Frank has essentially crossed a picket line. So like even that moment in the movie, which like has a glimmer of hope, is still fraught with tension. I mean, the union is basically broken at that point. And the strike breakers have been brought in. So again, it's a really good movie. Absolutely recommend it.
And I think like the bigger lesson thing, and it just sucks, but it's something we have to accept, is that like we're gonna lose more often than we win, and like that's definitely true of labor. I think a lot about Amazon in this context, but like I think the key is like are you learning from your defeats? Like, and there is a way where a defeat can plant a seed for a future victory. But it is just a reality that sometimes you can have the most willpower, the best strategy. There are certain structural forces that can defeat union drives, like it did in this movie.
Right. Yeah. And to go back to what I was saying earlier about how I think that all of the characters in the movie are extremely complex, and they're not just like no pun intended, black or white, or like good or bad, or like good or evil or whatever. I think the reason why the characters are like that is because, as you said, the film hews so close to the actual history, and it's just so close, it's just so clear in the movie that everybody involved is subject to these larger structural, political, and economic forces. Like, it's not just a matter of like breaking bread with your white or black coworker. Although in the movie that does happen, and sometimes the movie shows that is important and that, sometimes can overcome those larger forces and sometimes it can't.
Right.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.